Number 1. The private kingdom that time forgot. Somewhere between Australia and Sri Lanka, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, there's a scatter of coral atolls, so small you could walk across the entire landmass in an afternoon. 27 islands. 14 square kilometers total, around 600 people, and for nearly 150 years, this place wasn't run by a government, a parliament, or a president. It was run by one family, the Clunies-Ross family. And they didn't just live there, they owned it. Every coconut tree, every home, every job, every wage, and in many ways, every person's future belonged to them. Welcome to the Cocos Islands, also known as the Keeling Islands, a territory so obscure that most Australians, the very country that now governs it, couldn't point to it on a map. Ask someone in Sydney or Melbourne where the Cocos Islands are, and you'll mostly get blank stares. Maybe a guess involving Africa, maybe a confused mention of the Bahamas. Nobody expects the answer to be a tiny ring of coral sitting almost exactly halfway between Australia and Sri Lanka, closer to Jakarta than to Perth. But this is a story about how 6 generations of one family built, controlled, and eventually lost a private kingdom in paradise. And it's also a story about what life actually costs when you live on a speck of coral in the middle of nowhere, where the nearest supermarket is a plane ticket away, and the nearest hospital with real specialists is across an ocean. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right there. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm always amazed at how far this channel reaches. If you're new here, we cover places most travel channels won't touch, the forgotten corners of the map, the territories that slipped through the cracks of history. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next one, because next week we're heading somewhere even stranger, a place with its own currency, its own laws, and almost no permanent residents at all. Number 2, the Scottish sea captain who bought an empire for pennies. In 1826, a Scottish trader named John Clunies-Ross sailed into the Cocos Islands with his family and a small crew, looking for a place to resupply his ship. He found palm trees, empty beaches, and almost nobody living there. So, he decided to stay. At the time, the islands were technically unclaimed. No government had planted a flag, no navy patrolled the waters, so Clunies-Ross simply declared them his. He brought in workers from Malaysia to harvest coconuts, planted more palms across the atolls, and began building what would become the largest coconut plantation in the Indian Ocean. Picture what this actually looked like on the ground. A handful of white sand islands, barely above sea level, ringed by turquoise lagoons, with almost no freshwater sources of their own. Clunies-Ross had to design an entire system just to make human life sustainable there, catching rainwater, building cisterns, planting the coconut palms not just for profit, but because they were one of the only crops that could survive in coral soil, with almost no topsoil at all. It's worth pausing here to understand just how isolated this decision really was. This wasn't a captain settling near an existing port or colony where supplies and reinforcements were a short sail away. This was a family choosing to build an entire life, an entire economy, on a ring of sand so remote that the nearest major landmass was days away by sail. Every tool, every seed, every animal that would eventually populate those islands had to be brought in deliberately, piece by piece, on ships that might not return again for months. But here's the detail that made this different from every other colonial trading post of the era. Clunies-Ross didn't just employ workers, he created an entire closed economy. Workers were paid not in cash, but in a currency he invented himself, called the Cocos rupee. It could only be spent in one place, the company store, which he also owned. Think about what that actually means. If you worked on that plantation, you couldn't save money to leave. You couldn't buy goods from anywhere else. Every dollar, or rather every rupee, you earned went straight back into the pocket of the man who employed you. It was, in every practical sense, a private economy with no exit door. And it worked. For over a century, ships would arrive carrying rice, cloth, tools, and building supplies, all purchased by the family using real currency on the mainland, then sold back to workers at a markup using currency that existed nowhere else on Earth. It was a closed loop, elegant in its simplicity, and devastating in its effect on anyone born inside it. Number 3. The currency that trapped an entire population. By the time the second generation of Clunies-Ross took over in the mid-1800s, the islands had turned into something resembling a feudal kingdom. The family called themselves informally the Kings of Cocos, and the title wasn't just a nickname, they acted the part, holding court, settling disputes, deciding who could marry whom, deciding who could leave the islands and who couldn't. Workers lived in company housing. Their children attended a company school. When they got sick, they were treated by a company doctor. Every part of daily existence ran through the Clunies-Ross family, and the Cocos rupee ensured nobody could simply save enough to escape. Here's a number that puts it in perspective. At the height of the plantation economy, a coconut plantation worker might earn wages equivalent to just a few cents a day in real terms, and almost all of it flowed straight back to the company store for rice, cloth, and basic tools. There was technically a wage. There was practically no wealth. Compare that to what was happening on the Australian mainland during the same decades. While workers in Perth or Adelaide were organising unions, winning the 8-hour workday, building the foundations of modern labour law, workers on Cocos Islands were living under a system barely different from the one their grandparents had lived under generation after generation, with no minimum wage, no union, and no legal alternative employer within 1,000 miles. This wasn't slavery in the legal sense. Workers weren't shackled. But when your entire economic universe is owned by one family, when the only currency you're paid in is worthless anywhere else on Earth, freedom becomes a technicality. Some historians call this system paternalistic. Others call it something closer to indentured servitude with better public relations. Either way, it lasted generation after generation, largely unnoticed by the outside world, because nobody outside the islands had any reason to look. There were no journalists visiting, no international observers, just ships arriving every few weeks, loading coconut oil and copra and leaving again, while life on the ground continued exactly as it had for decades. What makes this even stranger is how the family managed to maintain this system without any real enforcement mechanism beyond the economics itself. There was no need for armed guards or physical barriers, because the currency did all the work. Even if a worker wanted to leave, wanted to build savings and buy passage off the islands, there was simply no way to convert Cocos rupees into anything usable anywhere else on the planet. The prison had no walls, no fences, no locked gates. It was built entirely out of a monetary system, which in some ways made it even harder to escape than a physical one, because there was nothing to physically fight against, no barrier to climb over, just an economic dead end disguised as employment. Number 4. The island nobody bothered to invade, until World War II changed everything. For over 100 years, the Cocos Islands stayed almost entirely off the map of global politics. Too small to matter strategically, too remote to interest colonial powers who already had bigger territories to manage. The British Empire, busy running India, Australia, and half of Africa, had little reason to concern itself with a handful of coral islands producing coconut oil for a niche market. Then came World War II, and suddenly this speck of coral became one of the most important cable and communication relay points in the entire Indian Ocean. Undersea telegraph cables ran through the region, connecting Australia to the rest of the British Empire, and controlling those cables meant controlling communication across half the globe. The The British set up a garrison. Japanese forces eyed the islands as a potential staging point for operations further into the Indian Ocean. In 1942, there was even a mutiny among the small garrisons stationed there, an event so obscure that most military historians barely mention it, yet it remains one of the only mutinies against British forces during the entire war. A handful of Sri Lankan soldiers stationed there, unhappy with conditions and commanding officers, attempted to seize control of the garrison. The mutiny was crushed within hours, and several soldiers were later executed, a grim footnote in a story that barely registers in most history books. Through all of this, the Clunies-Ross family kept running their plantation empire largely undisturbed. The war came and went. Empires rose and fell around them, but the coconut economy and the family that controlled it kept humming along exactly as it had for a century, almost as if the outside world's chaos simply couldn't reach this particular ring of sand and palm trees. By the 1950s, the family patriarch at the time, John Cecil Clunies-Ross, was being referred to in British reports as one of the last true feudal rulers left anywhere in the world. Not a king by law, but a king in every practical sense, presiding over subjects who had no vote, no alternative employer, and no currency that worked anywhere beyond his shoreline. Visitors who did occasionally pass through described a scene almost frozen in time. Workers tipping their hats to the family, children educated only in what the company deemed necessary, an entire community living inside a bubble the modern world had simply forgotten to pop. Number 5. The moment the United Nations noticed and the empire started to crack. Here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. In the 1970s, the United Nations began pushing a global decolonization agenda, pressuring remaining colonial territories and private fiefdoms around the world to either integrate with a legitimate government or become independent. Committees were formed, reports were written, and somewhere in that pile of reports, a small line item appeared. A set of islands in the Indian Ocean, still operating under something resembling 19th century feudalism. Australia, which had taken administrative responsibility for the Cocos Islands back in 1955, suddenly found itself under international pressure. How, in the modern era, could one family still be operating what was essentially a private feudal economy, complete with its own currency and no minimum wage, no labor protections, and no democratic representation for the hundreds of people living there? It was an embarrassing question for a country that liked to present itself as a modern, liberal democracy on the world stage. In 1978, the Australian government made a move that shocked the family. They forced John Clunies-Ross to sell the islands, the plantation, and all commercial holdings for $6.25 million Australian dollars. It sounds like a payout. It wasn't. Independent valuations at the time suggested the true worth of the estate, the land, the infrastructure, the decades of accumulated plantation assets was many times higher, some estimates placing it closer to $50 million, once you accounted for the full scope of what the family had built over 5 generations. The family fought back. They took the Australian government to court, arguing the forced sale violated their property rights, that this was effectively an act of government seizure dressed up as a purchase agreement. The legal battle dragged on for years, moving through Australian courts, generating headlines in Perth and Canberra, even as the rest of the world remained almost entirely unaware any of this was happening. But the outcome was already decided the moment the United Nations got involved. A private kingdom that had operated in near total isolation for 150 years was being dismantled by international pressure most of its own residents had never even heard of. Workers on Home Island, going about their daily lives, fishing, tending gardens, working the plantation, had little idea that halfway around the world, committees were deciding the fate of the only economic system they'd ever known. Number 6. The referendum that ended 150 years of rule in a single afternoon. In 1984, something remarkable happened. The people of Cocos Islands, the descendants of those Malay workers brought over generations earlier, were given the right to vote on their own future for the very first time in the island's history. Think about that for a moment. Generations of families had lived, worked, married, and died on those islands without ever once having a say in who governed them or how. The choice was simple: integrate fully with Australia, gaining Australian citizenship, wages, and legal protections, or continue some form of independence, potentially under continued influence from the Clunies-Ross family. The United Nations sent observers to monitor the vote, ensuring it was conducted fairly, free from any pressure the family might try to exert on a population that had depended on them for survival for generations. The vote wasn't close. The overwhelming majority chose integration with Australia. After 158 years of Clunies-Ross control, the family's authority over the islands ended, not through war, not through revolution, but through a ballot box on a quiet afternoon, in a place most of the world had never heard of. There were no soldiers, no barricades, no dramatic final showdown, just paper ballots, counted by hand, in small polling stations set up under palm trees. John Clunies-Ross, the last king of Cocos, remained on the islands for a time afterward, but his political and economic authority was gone. The Cocos rupee was abolished. Workers began earning real Australian wages for the first time in the island's recorded history, wages that could be saved, spent anywhere, sent to family members overseas, used to buy plane tickets off the island entirely if they wanted. The company store lost its monopoly, and the family that had built and ruled a private empire simply became, for the first time, ordinary residents, subject to the same laws and the same government as everyone else. Number 7. What happened to the family after they lost their kingdom? This is the part of the story that gets overlooked in most retellings. The Clunies-Ross family didn't just lose political control. Over the following years, they lost nearly everything else too. Legal disputes over the original 1978 sale dragged through Australian courts for over a decade, generation after generation of lawyers arguing over the true value of an empire that no longer existed in any practical sense. The family argued they'd been shortchanged, that the true value of their holdings, the plantation, the housing, the infrastructure they'd built over generations, was worth vastly more than what they'd been paid. Eventually, in the early 1990s, further settlements were reached, but by then, the family's influence on the islands had all but disappeared. What had once been an unquestioned dynasty was reduced to a handful of legal claims being argued over in courtrooms thousands of miles from the islands themselves. Some members of the family eventually left the Cocos Islands entirely, relocating to Western Australia and elsewhere, starting over in a country where their name carried none of the weight it once had on those coral atolls. The house they built, Oceania House, a grand colonial mansion that once served as the seat of their private rule, still stands on Home Island today, though it passed through different hands over the years, at times used for government functions, at times sitting largely empty, a strange monument to a century and a half of rule that ended almost overnight. What's striking is how quietly it all ended. No dramatic uprising, no coup, just an international legal process, a referendum, and a family that had ruled longer than most nations exist, finding themselves within a single generation as private citizens, with no more authority than anyone else, living on those beaches. There's something almost eerie about how completely a system can collapse without a single shot being fired. Just paperwork, court dates, and a vote nobody outside the region ever heard about. It raises an uncomfortable question too. How many other places on Earth right now operate under arrangements nobody outside has bothered to examine closely? Small islands, remote territories, places so far off the beaten path that the normal mechanisms of oversight simply never reach them. Cocos Islands only changed because the United Nations happened to be running a broad decolonization push during exactly the right decade. Without that timing, this story might have continued for another 50 years without anyone noticing at all. Number 8. What life actually looks like on Cocos Islands today. Now here's where this story connects to something bigger than one family's rise and fall. Because today, the Cocos Islands are still inhabited, still remote, and still one of the strangest places on Earth to actually build a life. There are two main inhabited islands. West Island, home to around 120 people, mostly Australian government workers, airport staff, and a small tourism operation, catering to divers and travelers chasing one of the most untouched coral reef systems left on the planet. Home Island, home to around 500 people, almost entirely descendants of the original Malay plantation workers who still speak Cocos Malay, still practice a distinct blend of Islamic and island culture, and still live in a community shaped by that century and a half of company rule. The two islands are separated by a lagoon and connected only by a small ferry that runs a handful of times a day. There's no bridge, no tunnel, just open water between two communities that share a single territory but live almost entirely separate daily lives. One largely secular and government-focused, the other rooted deeply in the traditions passed down from those original plantation families. Here's the number that surprises people. The cost of living on Cocos Islands is almost entirely dictated by shipping. Everything, from fresh produce to building materials to basic hardware, arrives by ship roughly once every few weeks, and by air on a limited weekly flight from Perth, which takes around 4 hours and costs several hundred Australian dollars each way. Miss that flight, miss that ship, and you're waiting, sometimes for weeks, for the next opportunity to bring in supplies. Because of this, a litre of milk that costs $2 in Perth might cost double or triple that on Home Island. Fresh vegetables are treasured, not guaranteed. Many residents keep chickens, fish daily from small boats, and grow what they can in coral soil that isn't exactly built for farming. Papaya, banana, and a handful of hardy vegetables manage to survive, but anything more delicate simply doesn't make the journey, or doesn't survive the salt air and thin soil once it arrives. And yet, rent and housing costs are almost non-existent by mainland standards, because there simply isn't a private property market the way there is in Sydney or Perth. Most housing on Home Island is either government-owned or passed down through families who've lived there for generations, meaning the crushing rent crisis that defines life in most Australian cities simply doesn't exist in the same way out here, though the trade-offs, as we'll get into, are substantial. Number 9. The strange economics of living on a coral atoll in the middle of the ocean. If you're the kind of person who dreams about escaping the mainland grind, about a life where rent isn't crushing you and salaries aren't disappearing into overpriced apartments, Cocos Islands presents a fascinating case study, and a cautionary one. On paper, life looks affordable. No skyscraper rents, no traffic, no property taxes eating into your paycheck the way they do in major cities. Public healthcare, as an Australian territory, is available through the same system of mainland Australians use, though anything beyond basic care means a flight to Perth, and that flight isn't always immediate. Education is free through the local primary school, though older students eventually need to leave the islands entirely to pursue secondary and higher education on the mainland. But the hidden costs are everywhere. Fuel for boats and vehicles has to be shipped in, and prices reflect that, often running well above what you'd pay anywhere on the Australian mainland. Internet access, for decades, was painfully slow and expensive, relying on limited satellite bandwidth shared across the entire population. Though recent satellite improvements, including newer low-orbit satellite technology, have helped close that gap considerably in just the past few years. Job opportunities are scarce outside of government positions, tourism, and fishing. If you want a career beyond those three paths, you're likely getting on that weekly flight to Perth and likely not coming back except to visit family. This creates a strange demographic reality where young people, ambitious people, people chasing careers in medicine, law, engineering, or technology almost always eventually leaving behind a population skewed toward older residents, government workers on rotational postings, and those deeply rooted in family land and tradition. And then there's isolation itself, which doesn't show up on any spreadsheet, but shapes daily life more than any grocery bill. When the nearest major hospital, the nearest shopping mall, the nearest university is a 4-hour flight and thousands of dollars away, low cost of living stops being simply a financial equation. It becomes a trade-off between money saved and access lost. A medical emergency that would mean a 15-minute ambulance ride in Perth can mean an emergency medical evacuation flight on Cocos Islands, an ordeal that's expensive, stressful, and entirely dependent on weather and aircraft availability. Consider something as simple as a birthday party. On the mainland, you drive to a store, pick from a dozen types of cake, 100 kinds of decorations, order whatever you want, same day. On home island, you plan weeks in advance around the shipping schedule, hoping the ingredients you need actually arrive on the boat you're counting on, and adjusting the entire event if they don't. Small inconveniences like this, multiplied across every part of daily life, add up to something that mainland residents rarely have to think about at all. Even something as basic as replacing a broken appliance becomes an ordeal. A washing machine that dies on the mainland gets replaced within a day or two. On home island, you might be washing clothes by hand for weeks while you wait for a replacement part to clear customs in Perth, get loaded onto a cargo flight or ship, and finally make its way across the ocean to your doorstep. Every convenience mainlanders take for granted gets stretched out, delayed, and taxed by distance in ways that quietly reshape how people plan their entire lives. This is the paradox at the heart of low-cost living. Almost anywhere remote, you escape the price of the mainland, but you inherit its absence too. The quiet, the space, the slower pace of life come bundled together with genuine sacrifice. Sacrifices that don't always show up until you actually need something the island simply can't provide. Number 10. Why a family history nobody's heard of matters for how we think about paradise. Here's the bigger point buried inside this story. When people dream about moving somewhere cheap, somewhere tropical, somewhere far from the grind, they rarely ask who actually controls that place and what history built the system they're stepping into. They see the palm trees and the turquoise water and imagine an escape without asking what invisible structures shaped the place long before they arrived. The Cocos Islands spent 158 years under the control of a single family, an arrangement that, from a distance, might look almost romantic. A private island kingdom, a dynasty ruling over palm trees and turquoise water. But underneath that image was a currency designed to trap workers, a company store designed to capture every wage paid out, and a population that had no legal recourse until the United Nations forced the issue in the 20th century. What looked like paradise from a passing ship was, for the people actually living there, an inescapable economic cage dressed up in tropical scenery. Today, the same islands offer something genuinely different: real wages, legal protections, a vote, a government accountable to actual law rather than the whims of one family's ledger. But the cost of living, the actual day-to-day price of milk, fuel, internet, and opportunity, is still shaped by geography that no referendum can change. You can vote away a king, you can't vote away 4 hours of open ocean between you and the nearest supermarket. Geography doesn't care about legal reforms. It just sits there, quietly setting the price of everything. That's the real lesson hidden inside this obscure slice of history. Low-cost living isn't just about who's in charge, or what currency you're paid in, or whether rent is cheap. It's about geography, supply chains, and the quiet infrastructure most of us never think about until we're the ones waiting for a ship that comes once a month. It's about weighing the price of a grocery bill against the price of isolation, and realizing those two things are almost never separate line items. They're the same equation, just measured differently. So here's a question worth sitting with. Would you trade the convenience of mainland life, the malls, the hospitals a few minutes away, the endless grocery options, for a place where the ocean is your front yard, the pace of life slows to the rhythm of tides, and 150 years of one family's private rule finally gave way to something resembling ordinary freedom? Would the trade-off be worth it for you? Or does the isolation outweigh everything the low cost of living seems to promise? If this story pulled you in, if a place you'd never heard of just became one of the strangest and most fascinating spots on Earth in your mind, do 3 things for me. Hit like, so this reaches more people who'd never have found it otherwise. Subscribe, because we're covering places just like this every single week. Forgotten corners of the map with histories nobody teaches in school. And drop a comment telling me the strangest place you've ever heard was once ruled by a single family or a single company, because I promise you, Cocos Islands isn't the only one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.